Good evening, everyone. I'm Bonnie McAdam. I'm the Jonathan L. Cohen Curator of American Art at the Hood Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and I'm going to say speakers. One will be doing the Q&A, and Diana will be presenting the major talk, but I'm delighted to welcome you both. In conjunction with our current exhibition, Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 60s, we're fortunate to have with us tonight two prominent scholars, Diana Linden and Craig Stephen Wilder, who will address a subject that carries national and local resonance. William Christopher's involvement in the civil rights movement is the topic, William Christopher's involvement in the civil rights movement. As many of you know, William Christopher, who died in 1973, taught studio art at Dartmouth in the early 1970s and was the partner of fellow artist George Tooker, with whom he lived in Hartland, Vermont, full-time since 1960. There's been very little written about Christopher, no doubt in part because his career was cut short by his premature death. Tooker's work, on the other hand, is more widely known today. In 2007, he received the National Medal of the Arts, the nation's top honor for artists and patrons of the arts, and the following year, his work was the subject of a major retrospective traveling exhibition. When he died in 2011, he left a bereaved but proud community of friends and fans in the Upper Valley. We can only wish that William Christopher had lived longer, so that we could have seen how both his art and his activism would have developed in subsequent decades. As we're about to hear in greater detail, both artists concerned themselves with social issues, but Christopher left an especially important historical record of that engagement, including diaries that document his involvement in the civil rights movement. And before I go on, I want to point out that we have a painting by William Christopher on view right across from the visitor services entrance. That's in our collection. And just next to it, a painting by George Tooker from our collection. There's also a Tooker on loan in the exhibition upstairs, and a small one in the American Gallery that's also in our collection. So try to seek them out, and I can lead you there if you need assistance. Scholar and educator Diana Linden has particular expertise in American visual culture from the early 20th century to the present. Dr. Linden received her PhD from the Graduate School of the City University of New York and has taught at Pomona College, the University of Michigan, UCLA, Claremont Graduate University, and Pitzer College. She's been enormously productive as a scholar and freelance grant proposal writer, and has also received a host of awards, fellowships, and grants herself, most recently the Society for the Preservation of American Modernists publication grant. Dr. Linden's interest in William Christopher emerges from her longtime focus on American art that addresses social and political issues, especially those pertaining to race, gender, religion, and ethnicity. Her latest book project is The New Deal Murals of Ben Shahn, Jewish Identity in the American Scene, which will come out next year. In 2012, she contributed the visual essay for the award-winning 3-volume book, City of Promises, The History of Jews in New York, 1654 to the Present. And together with Alejandro Andreas and Jonathan Weinberg, she co-edited The Social and the Real, Political Art of the 1930s in the Americas, published in 2006. Dr. Linden has also written scores of entries, articles, and essays pertaining to similar themes. I will cite just a few. She contributed entries to Latino History and Culture, an encyclopedia, and the Encyclopedia of African American Art and Architecture. Among her many articles are Modern, American, Jew, Museums and Exhibitions of Ben Shahn's Late Paintings, and with co-author Larry A. Green, Charles Austin's Harlem Hospital Murals, Cultural Politics in Depression-Era Harlem. The titles of 2 of Dr. Linden's many lectures inform us that she has been investigating the careers of William Christopher and George Tooker for several years. In 2009, she presented What's Going On? The Civil Rights Work of George Tooker and William Christopher at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which co-organized the major retrospective. And in 2011, she gave a lecture titled The Civil Rights Work of William Christopher at the National Portrait Gallery. We look forward to hearing her latest thoughts on that subject. Now, after she presents, Craig Stephen Wilder will be moderating the Q&A session. And he is professor and head of the history faculty at MIT, where he studies and teaches American urban, intellectual, and cultural history. Professor Wilder received his PhD from Columbia University and has held academic posts at Long Island University, Williams College, and from 2002 until 2008 at Dartmouth College, where he was Professor of History and Chair of the African and African American Studies program. We're delighted to welcome him back to Dartmouth. Professor Wilder's most recent book is Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities, published in 2013. He also authored In the Company of Black Men, The African Influence on African American Culture in New York City, and A Covenant with Color, Race and Social Power in Brooklyn. If we consider William Christopher and George Tucker to be artist activists, then Craig Stephen Wilder is a scholar activist. He began his career as a community organizer in the South Bronx and now provides curricular and professional development workshops with public school teachers in low-income areas of New York City. He also advises community and social organizations in New York and is a senior fellow at the Bard Prison Initiative, a program that has given hundreds of men and women the opportunity to acquire a college education during their incarceration in the New York State prison system. Professor Wilder has also advised and appeared in numerous historical documentaries, including the celebrated Ken Burns, Sarah Burns, and David McMahon film, The Central Park Five, and directed or advised exhibits at regional and national museums, including the Brooklyn Historical Society, the New York Historical Society, the Chicago History Museum, the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn. I know we're all very eager to learn more about William Christopher and the civil rights movement, so please join me in welcoming Diana Linden, and then later Craig Stephen Wilder. Why don't you stand up and wave too, Craig, so people are around. That's you. That's me.
That was such a nice intro. Thank you. So I should sit, can everyone hear me? Okay. The last public lecture I gave ended with me falling off the stage. So my goal for this evening is, if I don't face plant, we've had a successful night. Not to set things too low or high. Let me just start. Okay, it does elapse. This is a photograph of William Christopher by George Platt Lynes. It's from the 1940s. And it's Christopher on the left and Dr. King on the right. On January 1st, 1963, the United States celebrated the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. Later that same month, in his studio in Hartland, Vermont, William, known as Bill Christopher, 1924 to 1973, articulated a new, profound sense of artistic and social purpose, which was intimately bound up with the ongoing civil rights movement, in particular the actions of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Christopher cracked the spine of a brand new diary filled with lined pages and in cursive hand wrote out his intentions for the coming year. He wrote, "I want to do a series of paintings dedicated to Martin Luther King, such a wonderful man helping all of us. I must do it even though I realize the difficulties that may arise. It does seem that all responsible people are keeping quiet, and after all, are we not artists responsible? I am responsible," and he underlines, "to the spirit, and Martin Luther King is leading the spirit of us. I am so proud to be from Georgia, where he can help. Perhaps I can help. I must try. I must put everything I can into these paintings. I must make them my finest work. They must not be sentimental, but bold, to the point. I feel needed as an artist like I haven't felt before," end quote. Christopher would devote all of 1963 to this project. And one wonders what motivated Christopher, a white, Southern, gay man, age 40, to pursue this series, and why he felt the kindred sense he did with King and Southern blacks that he expresses in his diary and articulates in paint. And this is Dartmouth's painting. This is Contemplation of the Mask, 1963. And today, Craig and I wish to recuperate the civil rights paintings of William Christopher, whose contemplation of the mask is owned by Dartmouth. Christopher painted 5 paintings, oil on acrylic on board, and created one collage, all in honor of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963. He also painted, one piece after the March on Selma in 1965. The majority of these works are all now lost and known to us only through bad black and white photographs of black and white Xeroxes. So this makes Dartmouth painting all the more special and all the more, I hope, appreciated. This is how the series works. There is an order to it. Christopher's organizational method, and let me see if I've got this. Okay, this is Basin. We don't know where it is. On the back of each painting, they're all inscribed in honor of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So all 5 paintings. And then he'll dedicate it to some individual. And I'll talk about this a bit more. Here it's James L. Daniels, who I have not been able to find out who he is. I hope to find out. So each one is dedicated to a prominent African-American artist or individual whom Christopher admired, such as he dedicates one to Rosa Parks, who he did not know. Whoops. No, there. This is Ocelia Archer. Dartmouth's painting is dedicated to her. She was a celebrated African-American actress and theatrical director whose son graduated from Dartmouth, and he bequeathed the painting to the college and the museum. In his 1963 diary, which he wrote in diligently and with great passion, he stressed daily the seriousness of his venture, noting, quote, all the Negroes, end quote, who had helped him to become an artist. People such as Buford Jelani at the left and sculptor Richmond Barth on the right. And in these diaries that I found at Boston University, he tells great stories, and he tells this great story of the elder to him, Delaney, taking him out in Christopher Street, out to McDougal Street, and then in the village during the 1940s, and Christopher just taking him into any old bar, not thinking about it. And he doesn't understand why they're being refused service over and over again. So finally, Delaney looks at him and said, so now have you learned the lesson? So he's being instructed not just as an artist, but as a human being and as a man from the South, what to expect. In all 5 paintings, Christopher depicts Black women evidencing great personal agency, with individual emotion, with visual beauty, and also with thought and conscience. Obviously not these images. Christopher focused attention to Black women is all the more significant because of the overall erasure of positive, progressive imagery of Black womanhood from visual culture, popular culture, and the arts in the United States during the early 60s, and we could say today as well. We can recognize this Aunt Jemima button that you got when you ate all your hot oats and you got your button club. This is a case of what was called the welfare queen, that they took a photo of a white woman who was on welfare, throw away the word queen, she was on welfare, showed it to people, and they preferred the Photoshop image of her as if a Black woman as the one who's truly on welfare. So it's getting at the racial implications and assumptions about welfare women, and welfare queen under Reagan became one of the big terms used to describe women who were seeking financial assistance. Feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins writes about the pervasive and pathological imagery of African American women on our visual landscape, and the effects such grotesque and stereotypical image have both upon ourselves and society. And am I talking really fast? No? Okay. I am? I can breathe? Okay. That's good to know. Okay. She writes about these images, the impact on our landscape and on ourselves and on society, and she writes, from the mammies, Jezebels, and breeder women in slavery to the smiling Aunt Jemimas on pancake mix boxes, ubiquitous black prostitutes, and ever-present welfare mother of contemporary popular culture, negative stereotypes applied to African American women have been fundamental in black women's oppression. So it's pointing out that these are images that have a power, they have an effect. It's not something passive that's being done with these images. In contrast, by examining Christopher's images and his 1963 diary within the history and culture of the early 60s, we hope to show that his powerful female imagery effectively countered the secondary role or the invisibility to the public of female civil rights workers. The public face of the civil rights movement were such great men as King, Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, all straight churchmen who stood at the fore and whom in effect pushed gay men such as Bayard Rustin, and black women out of the spotlight. And even when a woman entered the historical record, her personhood was crafted in a non-threatening way, such as originally was done with Rosa Parks. And when I was a kid, and probably when you were a kid, we were taught that she was this old lady and she was tired and she just sat down. She was 42. That's the first part that got me. And this was an organized protest. So that has been revised, that knowledge, but more work is being done, and recent revisionist studies on Rosa Parks actually changed the point of origin of the civil rights movement. Instead of saying it began 1955 with the bus boycott, it should go back to the early 1940s when Rosa Parks was a lead investigator and activist in anti-rape campaigns, attacks on black women specifically in the black community. So it's really, if you're looking at the timeline and the impact on women, it's reshaping this whole chronology. And I'm plugging the book that talks about her anti-rape activism, because it's really one of the most difficult books to read because it's so emotional, but it is fascinating in terms of the history it tells. And the author says, on later years, historians would paint Parks as a sweet and reticent old woman whose tired feet caused her to divide Jim Crow on Montgomery City buses. Her solitary and spontaneous act, the old story goes, sparked the 1955 bus boycott and gave birth to the civil rights movement. What we weren't told was that Rosa Parks was a militant race woman, a sharp detective, and an anti-rape activist long before she became the patron saint of the bus boycott. And in fact, there were many women active in the civil rights movement and essential to its progress, such as Parks, Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was so angered by the gendered organization of the civil rights movement that she said it was just as sexist and as hierarchical the structure of the black churches. It was reproducing this standard. Dr. King wanted black men to be seen as men, to work as men, to be husbands and fathers in the middle-class norm of the day. And one thing is, when you look at the Nation of Islam, you look at the Black Panthers, a bit less so. You look at the Civil Rights Movement, you look at the Citizens Council, which was part of the Klan down south. They all had the same agreement on women. It was their women and how their women should be treated, and that was secondary and in the home. The career of, I can't decide if it's better with glasses or out, it's that in-between stage. The career of Bill Christopher has, for all intensive purposes, fallen into the dustbin of art history, except here at Dartmouth. If he is mentioned at all in the current literature, it's because he was the long-term partner of realist painter George Tooker, who died in 2011, who shared his commitment also to racial equality. Christopher was born in Georgia. His father died when Bill was young, and subsequently Christopher was primarily raised by the family's African-American servants. In terms of artistic training, he studied at the Sorbonne, Académie Julienne, École des Beaux-Arts, and also in New York. Christopher and Tucker met in 1949 and were together until Christopher's death in 1973. These are two works by Tucker. The one on the right you can see out in the galleries because it's owned by Dartmouth College, and I believe it's called Half a Dozen Eggs. And it's his statement on racial integration. This is called, not Summer 1963, Supper. I knew I had it wrong, Supper 1963. And it's a recreation, a reference to the Supper at Emmaus, here with a black Christ leading the meal. There's a strong sense of religiosity that permeates the entire diary, the 1963 diary. And Christopher concluded the first day's entry, that was January 31st, by turning his focus entirely to King and writing. When he went to Montgomery to help, and I heard that one of the things he said was, "Arise, sweet spirit, and cast off thy yoke of oppression. That is where I'll begin." God sent him, the angel, the voice from the dark. These words would lead Christopher into his first painting of the series, which was not the Dartmouth painting. It's this painting on right, which is found at a library in Boston University, but it's kind of tucked away among the King holdings. So I don't even know if the Art Museum is aware of it or they keep the records for it, but it's not highlighted there in any means. He began the canvas January 31st. He worked on it throughout February, and he completed what he called Awakening, Arise, Sweet Spirit on March 7th, 1963. So this is Christopher. His hair went white really early. We're seated with two paintings. The one on the left is now lost. The one at BU. And this is his handwriting, William Christopher, with two of his paintings in honor of Dr. King. When you go through his journal and his diary, you see that he had puzzled over how to use such traditional attributes and props as masks and mirrors, and how to picture the woman's gaze in the painting and to create a sense of her coming to awareness. He made reference in notations of paintings he had seen, such as Titian's Venus with Cupid, 1555 at the National Gallery of Art, and how the use of the mirror here catching the reflection, the woman's attention, is so effective. So he had a very traditional artistic training. He was going back to that in creating his work. He wrote in his notations were primarily focused on the white mask, which you can see here in the woman's lap, as the key to his painting's meaning and the narrative of the work, writing, "Mask painted white, it can speak many ways. The wearing of the mask by the Negroes to pacify white people who demand it in order to subjugate. How tired people must be with the heavy white weight in their laps." Just again, another image he thought about, the sense of a recoiling figure receiving a message from up high, from an angel. You see some of this in the way her body is, the woman in the painting on the left is pulled back. Masks and mirrors are two key issues and elements in his paintings and in his writing. And in awareness, he splits the painting into thirds. At left, a black woman with a mirror in her right hand gestures to her companion as if to say, "Come here, come forth, arise." In other words, come here, look at your own reflection, put down that mask, and look at who you really are, in order to shock herself, make herself become into consciousness. Christopher described the woman as left here as an angel, which is the same term by which he referred to King. To her right, and the focus of the angel's attention, sits the second woman with her eyes half closed, half open as her body recoils backwards. She regards the circular white mask she cradles in her lap, but let me ask you, what moment is being captured? Has she taken the mask off? Or is she struggling and resisting at the same time the need to place it back on? With turned down mouth, it's hard to see this, let me see. In the mirror, you can see her face is somewhat turned down, her mouth is turned down, her face is elongated, it gives a sense of displeasure. And she's awakening to the truths of the tyranny of the mask worn by African Americans within greater society. And here she's engaging herself with W.E.B. Du Bois' conception of double consciousness, and I'm just going to let the quote speak for Du Bois at this point. Throughout 1963, Christopher challenged himself to regard his own mirror, to witness his own reflection, to acknowledge his own whiteness, to thoroughly scrutinize and then cast off his own blinders of white privilege that was his birthright coming up in the deeply segregated Jim Crow South. And this is, I was mentioning, I think to Craig, this is not a science, or Mary, this is not a scientific method of art history, but I posted the picture with no information on Facebook and said, tell me the story, who did this? And everyone assumed it was either a black male or female artist. The conception that this could be a white Southerner who grew up in the Deep South just seemed no way could be possible because of the sensitivity of the image. So he's challenging himself, he's investigating his own privilege, his own history, and he then wants to cast off his own blinders of white privilege. That was his birthright coming up during the deeply segregated Jim Crow South. Christopher had enjoyed the privileges that white skin conferred and which cut across class lines. While composing Contemplation of the Mask, Christopher realized that he must renounce such privileges so that he might create honest art of social importance and do justice to the subject matter. But was this at all possible for a white artist to do? There were those who believed so, such as Bayard Rustin, who I've shown previously, who was the principal organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms of '63, and who counseled King on techniques of nonviolent resistance. Rustin believed that artists could be colorblind and could paint regardless of their own tone. In 1970, on the occasion of Jacob Lawrence winning an award from the NAACP, Rustin spoke about the role of the artist in the freedom struggle, and he addressed that was later published in the NAACP's Crisis. And he wrote, all over the country today, people are saying if the painting is about a black man, it is not, if a painting about a black man is not done by a black man, then there's something wrong. A white man who is a great artist with great insight can write, paint, and do anything artistic about blacks, and what will be revealed will be his insight and his trueness, not his whiteness. This is also in the possession of Dartmouth. This is graphite drawing for the painting, Contemplation, which we're going to look at a little more closely. Am I still talking too fast? No? Yeah? No? Okay. So I want to look more closely at Dartmouth's painting, and today was the first time I got to see it in person, after puzzling over it for so many years. An African-American woman sits alone with her thoughts within a nondescript setting. Just a portion of the table is covered with a white cloth. Light falls from the left, bringing attention to her face, her arms and hands, and the white mask laying out before her, which she gently touches with her left fingertips. She is shown in profile, and the woman's hair is closely cropped as if a cap, which was not the style in the early 60s, from what I've been able to judge. The manner in which the white cloth on the table before her is bunched up suggests that as she is refusing, pushing away the white mask, unwilling to once more place it upon her face. There's a sense both of specificity, a word I should not ever write, specificity as well as of timelessness about the seated woman. Creating what Christopher called a dialogue of curves in the painting, the woman's face slopes and melds into her right hand, which is posed in a gesture that suggests contemplation or perhaps even melancholia, as seen here by Dürer. What the artist has done is catch her mid-thought, and that this woman, this African-American woman, is portrayed as conscious and thoughtful and in control of her own being, breaks from dominant representations of Black women in Western art history, which range from erotic submissive figures to scientific specimens to sentimental fantasies of nurturing slaves. Looking further into the painting, the woman's white dress echoes the bare white cloth on which a mask is placed. Presumably it is she who has placed the mask on the table. We don't see who else might have done it. It's an unknown. The bareness of the setting, by contrast, brings greater attention to her lovingly rendered face and her hands as well. If you can see, and you can see it best in the real thing, of course, the white mask, her mask has been tailored so it's specific to her contours of her face, her same high cheekbones, her pursed outlined lips, and slightly sloped nose. The mask belongs to her and her alone. It has been personalized to fit her. It is if cast directly from her face. Such masks were necessary for African American women and men to successfully negotiate a racially tiered society, and yet could be discarded within one's own community. It was the sense of communal self-determination that Christopher was attempting to represent, despite the great disabilities and distance of his race and gender. In other words, she frees herself of the mask. There's no white authority figure removing it for her. Or she chooses to put it back on due to social pressures. Christopher's visions and images were not clouded by a heterosexual voyeuristic view that would have caught the woman unaware in some type of licentious manner. Instead, there's a sense of earnestness rather than eroticism to the woman. Christopher is frozen a moment between thought and action, which leaves this audience to wonder, to question, has she just again taken off the mask? Is she about to place it back on? If she is about to put it back on, why must she? What is the force we don't see that is laying pressure upon her? The woman is the only figure, the only actor within this painting, so there must be some force that we're not acknowledging that exists outside of the realm of the painting. This scene and the woman's contemplation of the mask readily called to mind poet Paul Laurence Dunbar's oft-quoted "We Wear the Mask" of 1896, which starts off, "We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks, it shades our eyes." And I'm not saying that Christopher based it on the poem, but there's a shared statement and sentimentality about these two works, the poetry and the painting. Finally, by leaving the narrative inconclusive, I believe Christopher echoed the liminal status of Black women in the United States in the early 1960s, both within greater society and within the art world as well. Now, his diaries, there are actually two diaries. There's one that dates from 1965, and that's at the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C., and in going through that, I realized that there had to be a second diary, and that's the one I found that's located at BU. In his diary, the 1963 one, which concerns the series of painting, he goes on rhapsodically about the works of Georges de la Tour, of Rembrandt, of Caravaggio, turning to these old masters and others as composition and painterly guides for his new series, showing his classic and academic training in Europe. He also referenced Benin sculpture and Nigerian masks as prototypes. Christopher had a small collection of African masks and entitled one painting that was done apart from the series, Iko Eso, a type of Nigerian mask, and of course, the painting is lost. Ultimately, Christopher, though, located his artistic inspiration in the streets of Memphis, the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in Christian scripture, in the water hoses and dogs that the white police turned on black protesters and residents in Birmingham, Alabama, and by critiquing his own childhood as a white boy coming up in the Deep South. We'll go back to the masks. Okay. A knock-knock joke from the civil rights era. What has four eyes and doesn't see? If anyone gets this, I'm just going to be blown away. So, you know it? Say it. Mississippi. Before and throughout the civil rights era, Brooklyn political pundits, poets, somewhere in Brooklyn, essayists, activists, and artists spoke of blindness versus sight, light versus darkness, visibility versus invisibility, and whiteness versus blackness to describe both the segregated South and the long ongoing struggle for racial equality in America, as well as discussing the qualities of painting itself. The reference and use of masks are many within both African and African American culture. In many essays, memoirs, novels, Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask of 52 and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, also 52, the authors describe the leeching experience of being invisible to white society in a manner to oneself. Writer Lillian Smith, this is another book which I came upon that I think is just fantastic. Lillian Smith addressed her own sense of white entitlement in her 1949 memoir, Killers of the Dreams, asking herself in the greater Southern society in which she came up, why don't we see this? Is there a tendency to blindness in those who overvalue their whiteness? Sometimes I think so. Even those who cannot be called racist, there is blindness. As a child, Smith was taught, as Christopher had been as well, that, quote, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son so that we might have segregated churches in which it was my duty to worship each Sunday. I learned it was possible to be a Christian and a white Southerner simultaneously, and to pray at night and ride a Jim Crow car the next morning, and to feel comfortable in doing both. In 1962, in the searing book, The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin insisted that racial blindness extinguished the souls of whites and blacks alike, stating that a vast amount of white anguish is rooted in the white man's equally profound need to be seen as he is, to be released then from the tyranny of his own mirror. All of us know, whether or not we are able to admit it, that mirrors can only lie, that death by drowning awaits one there. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. So it's been said that in a manner, perhaps Christopher is using himself, testing himself to see if he can free himself from white privilege, and his own commitments of love are part of that as well. Christopher would depart from the subject of women and even put aside the painting as his medium to create Birmingham, a collage that he assembled from words and phrases cut from popular magazines, and which was driven by a blinding rage he felt about the events in Birmingham, Alabama, otherwise known as Birmingham, Alabama. And you have a photograph outside with that name, no, a painting entitled Birmingham. Christopher had earlier worked in collage in the early 1960s. In his diaries, he refers to these earlier works as his Negro paintings, and he notes the attention paid to them by James Baldwin. He loves to name drop. So he's at parties with Bricktop and Harry Belafonte and just all these wonderful people, and just happens to be talking to James Baldwin. Birmingham. On April 9th, Christopher writes in his diary, Dr. King is planning a huge march on Good Friday in Birmingham. I hope all will go well and the police leave them alone. Certainly, all marches have been banned. He gives such hope. And then just a few days later, on Good Friday, Christopher pens, Dr. King and Abernathy have been arrested for marching. How must it be in a Southern jail? To be a Negro in a Southern jail, he underlines that. This would soon come, the world would know how it actually was, because King was writing his famous letter from Birmingham jail, which Christopher noted in his diary on April 22nd. King from his jail cell wrote, "Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States." This is a famous photograph by Charles Moore. And I'd say until this exhibition, what we mostly knew of the visual culture of the civil rights movement were the photographs. And primarily the photographs from white magazines, primarily white magazines like Life and Look, less so Ebony and Jet. And these are types of magazines that Christopher is going to be pulling from for his work. Violence consumed Birmingham during the long months of March and April 1963, directed by Eugene Bull Connor, 1897 to 1973. And just his dates to me, he's starting in the era of Plessy versus Ferguson. He's dying in the early 1970s. The resistance the man must have had to all these changes because his world changed multiple times over. I'm not being sympathetic to him. I'm just explaining how he's viewing the world as changing. He was the staunchest segregationist and commissioner for public safety, which oversaw the fire and police departments, and who infamously set attack dogs and turned water hoses on citizens and protesters. His strategy of using dogs and high-powered water hoses backfired on Connor as it drew international focus and shame to the southern city. As I said, prior to this exhibit, we mainly knew works by Danny Lyons, Gordon Parks, Charles Moore. But was how do I put this? What was innovative and shocking to a white middle-class family in 1963 sitting in their living room and looking at Life magazine was old news to the African-American community who'd been living through it and circulating images and through their own newspapers and their own magazines. So there's the white America woke up decades later. There's been I just want to point out, a lot of work recently on these photographs of the civil rights movement. I'm not going to get too much into that at this point, but these are his. Okay, these are some of his notes. It's very hard to make out. But what I want to show you is, it's kind of scary reading his notes about Birmingham. He starts quoting our Father, who's in heaven. He starts including a lot of biblical verses. He starts writing 2 lines to every line in the page in the book. There's a sense of fury and almost exhaustion and madness about how consumed he is with what's happening in Birmingham. And I counted there's about 12 pages like this. What he decides to do with his Birmingham works is create this collage, Birmingham or Memories of My Childhood, 1963. Now, he primarily works from Life magazine, Look magazine. He's not going to the black newspaper and journals at this point. But he started to pull out a whole host of material. And he wrote at one point, "As I go through these magazines, I find a host of material. It is really amazing how much is revealed by a nation in its printing factories that cater to the public. The scope is terrific. By the slightest twist or cutting out of one word or the juxtaposition of another, a new meaning can be made. I often wonder of the sublimated images and messages that we read in ads and editorials, the white nationalism that comes through, the blinded eyes of refusal to admit reality," end quote. So he's cutting all these documentary images, and That's the button he said not to hit. Okay. That scared me. Okay, we see some familiar images, such as people with water hoses being turned on them. And this man turning back, I believe this is after looking regarding into the policeman. But the majority of these images, they're words, phrases cut out, but then you have this whole thing about shampoo and rinse your hair, shampoo, rinse again. And he has a whole area to Beefeater Scotch. And what he's saying in his words and those words is, these are the things that white America just occupies itself with. Commodity goods, leisure goods, and people are being blown away in the streets. So he's constantly critiquing what would be seen as his own community. Do we have time? We have 5 minutes. I'm going to just skip Race Riot and get to the end of what happened. So this is Christopher with the white hair, and with the white hair, and this is Dr. King meeting. They met in March of They met in 1964. Christopher wrote a letter to Martin Luther King. It's very flowery. It's very emotional, saying, I want to give you a gift of these paintings. I spent this whole year painting. And King accepts a painting. He picks out one himself, Dark Mirror, which is lost, was hung in his office at the SCLC office in Atlanta. Its whereabouts, I tried contacting King family. No one knows where it is. And the two men corresponded for a while, and King said, I want to meet you. I'm going to go down to Boston to donate my papers to BU Library. They met there, and that's where the photograph of Christopher seated below two paintings was taken. It was then in March of '65 that Dr. King extended an invitation to Christopher and George Tooker to come down to Selma, which they did. Christopher's going home to the South, but he was disavowing the comfort of white privilege that he had been taught was his birthright. Instead, Christopher wished, to quote from James Baldwin, to be released from the tyranny of his own mirror, and to examine what Lillian Smith called the haunted childhood that belonged to every Southerner pre-civil rights era. From January to March '65, King oversaw the march in Selma for civil rights. Tooker and Christopher met up with Dr. King and joined in the marches and protests. While there, the couple attended the famous funeral memorial for Reverend James Reeb, a 38-year-old Unitarian Universalist minister, white, from Boston, who had been murdered in Selma by a white mob. Reeb died of massive head injuries in a hospital in Birmingham. The Monday after Reeb's death, on March 15, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson's voting rights proposal reached Congress. President Johnson called the recent events in Selma an American tragedy, which he said should strengthen people's determination to, quote, bring full and equal and exact justice to all our people. He stated that in Selma, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed. And Congress went on to enact the Voting Rights Acts quite quickly right after that. However, I have to point out, it was the death of a white man, Reeb, that initiated such a national outcry, while only 2 weeks earlier in Marion, Alabama, the police had shot and killed Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was protecting his mother from a beating by the police. And Jackson's case did not attract any national attention, and justice was not pursued in his case. Just to close with, Christopher and his partner, to give full sense of these two men, especially of Christopher, I have 4 minutes, did more than create paintings in the spirit of the civil rights movement. Both men left their studios to enter the public realm on behalf of the struggle. They met in meeting halls in Vermont and New Hampshire, town hall forums, and churches. Tooker directed payments for the reproduction of his art to the NAACP, and both were members of Dartmouth's NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Christopher helped organize the local branch of the NAACP in Hanover, and he exhibited his painting at fundraisers at Freedom House in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And for CORE, he wrote seething letters protesting Alabama Governor George Wallace's actions. So in conclusions, the decades spanning the Brown decision of '54 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 saw more social change, more court decisions, and more legislation in the name of civil rights than any decade in our nation's history to date. Because of the struggle, 1/3 of the nation, the South, was changed forever. Most certainly, William Christopher as an artist and as a man was changed forever. William Christopher serves, I believe, as an example as an artist who successfully melded aesthetic achievement with social commentary and social action. And in fact, moving beyond commentary into committed organization and action. So in closing, in the words of both King and Christopher, to the spirit. Thank you.
Stay right there.
Did you write down everything I said wrong?
Yes, I actually got it all wrong. Don't worry. First, I just wanted to thank you for that and just say a couple of things. She presented this to me, this idea to me, about a year ago, right?
Right, yeah.
She sent me an email describing the Tooker painting and the research on it. And she said, "What should I do with this?" And I said, "Well, you have to do it. And go to Dartmouth. You have to do it." And so since then, I've been cheerleader. Very good cheerleader.
Yeah,
A very bad research assistant, an unreliable research assistant. This morning, I was a very good chauffeur in the rain. And now I'll be a decent moderator. But one of the things I thought was so powerful about the initial image that you sent me, because I knew nothing about Christopher and very little about Tooker, and one of the things that caught me was just both in his writing in the diary, but also in the images, the extraordinary sense that he has of the liberationist potential of the civil rights movement. The choice of black women as subject matter, the way in which they're actually painted and in which the images are framed, and his relationship, his gaze on them, actually suggest a lot about what he saw as the power of the civil rights movement for Americans generally. And I just wanted to start by asking you that and then open it up to the audience, just to talk a bit more about that.
This is a man of faith in terms of his Christianity, but faith in this process of change. And I do think he's looking at the liberation potential not only for black Americans, but for himself as a white American. And that quote that Baldwin said, is freeing, there's freeing as much black America as white America. Where he stumbles a bit, and it is that while he envisions these powerful black women, he doesn't go far enough in a manner. It's still keeping them as artistic statements and props. And it's interesting that I think that he can't find a way to engage the black male figure or the white male figure in this drama.
And one of the things I was fascinated by is the masking metaphors and imagery within African American culture. It's quite clear, but also within gay male culture, it's there. And so there are different ways in which he's actually, different messages that are being represented in all of those works. But why don't we open up to the audience for questions? And
I just want to say to that, I often think about the mask as the portable closet in some ways.
To address that point of the portable closet, was he closeted during most of his time in the South? And
He got out of the South as fast as he could.
Was he in the closet as a gay man? Do you know?
No. In the South, yes. There's some story about when he was in the Army and about being roughed up, but he doesn't really talk about it. I don't know if he was being bullied or because he was gay. He and Tooker lived openly together for 30 some odd years, but they also traveled in gay circles. So he was out, he was open, but he wasn't announcing in many ways, if
I
that makes
guess
sense.
I'm asking this question because it's my understanding that in the black community particularly, and perhaps more so in the South, there is a real discrimination against.
Can you speak? I'm hard
There's
of
a-
hearing, that's why we gave you the mic.
Oh, I need to hold it closer, sorry. I was asking the question because it's my understanding that in the black community, and perhaps more so in the South, that there's a real discrimination against homosexuality. And so that's why I was curious to know whether he was public about his homosexuality when he was in the South.
You want me or you?
Sure. You want to go first?
The Black Christian Church is very conservative on sexuality. I'm from the East Coast, but I live in California now, and when Obama won and Prop 8 lost, the slogan was "Proud California, Disappointed American," or the verse, saying that the Black Church did not see a parallel civil rights movement for gay America. In the years he was growing up in the South, he had to be closeted to survive. When he was older, he was in more of a group. I need a little bit more from what you're saying.
There's also, there's a complex history of, the history of sexuality within African American communities gets complicated.
Yeah.
And one of the complications is, for instance, Bruce Nugent, the Harlem Renaissance writer and novelist, who does, in fact, an unpublished novel about the civil rights movement, including figures like W.B. Du Bois, in which he actually really deals with the subject of sexuality quite explicitly. A group of Harlem Renaissance artists and writers had also did so in the magazine Fire.
Right.
And one of the things that Nugent writes about and talks about later on in his oral history, which I believe is actually collected in the oral history collection, You Must Remember This. Nugent actually talks about his encounter with W.B. Du Bois and their exchange on the question of sexuality and whether or not Renaissance artists should be dealing with the subject of sexuality. And Nugent was quite open about his sexuality. He was quite open about the sexuality of other people in the movement. And so it gets really complicated there. And also I think there is also a tendency to use a kind of post-Stonewall language
Right.
for a pre-Stonewall period. And Nugent does that too in the oral history. He talks about the closet and then declares that there was no closet. And what he meant was that he was open and his friends were open. But in fact, actually a better way of describing it using the same quote might be, in fact, that there was no closet, literally meaning that it's pre-Stonewall. And the world that they were operating in was regulated by a different set of cultural norms.
It's also interesting to me that some of the commentators who are gay, Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, Christopher in this way, are also often involved in interracial languages, interracial lovers, relationships. So there's also a way that there's a diversity within the gay community that is supporting diversity in the greater community.
And you can talk about that a bit in Tucker's life, who's
Yeah.
a man of mixed race who had actually passed at short periods
Right.
in his life, and yeah.
Right.
Last night, I actually did go to the Smithsonian Archives and read the diary of Christopher's, his going to the memorial service for Reed and then on to Selma. And it's magnificent writing. It was really pleasurable. But it leaves me curious because he's somewhat obscure. We don't know so much about him. And so I was pleased but surprised that his diaries went to the Smithsonian. And so I just wonder if you can talk more about how his writing became so notable and got preserved when his paintings, so many of them were lost. And I'm also curious about the paintings and what it means that they were lost, and wonder if you could talk about that as well.
Lost can mean they're owned by private collectors, lost to the public. So I have lists of names of people who own them in some cases. And then when I've tried to contact and Google these people or find out, we're talking descendants, and no one knows which cousin got the painting when, Uncle Henry died. I don't know of any cases where anything was destroyed. The King papers and the King family is kind of a mess. Was that nicely said, understated? So trying to trace within the King archives where one painting went was very difficult. Can you say again, I couldn't hear your beginning question.
She went to the Smithsonian.
Oh, you went to the Smithsonian?
I read the writings about his attendance at the memorial for Reed, and then going to Selma, and it's such great writing, and I see that this is another piece. And so because so much of him was lost, and he seems somewhat obscure, I hadn't heard of him before, I was curious about how paintings are lost, but his writing has been preserved at the Smithsonian. I think that's lovely, but I wonder if you could talk more about how that process happened and how all that got preserved so well for us.
If I'm understanding you correctly, we have the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art. There is a repository set up, a process set up. So he kept his whole papers his whole life. I don't know if it was he, I have to double check, but I think it was Tooker who donated them.
The website says he donated them.
He did, okay. They're not microfilmed, so it's not been seen as a priority to microfilm them. So there was already a process in hand. He was in ill health his whole life, and he knew this was an important part of his work, so he took the time to make this repository. They were also moving to Spain to live in Spain for a little bit, so it may have been also cleaning out the spaces. The papers make one big but neat to find package. The paintings go in different directions. I'd love Boston to lend what they have to keep, or give it to, why not? To keep the two paintings company and be able to see more than one.
I was very struck by the painting with the woman sitting at the table with her hand on the mask.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that was very striking about it, and somewhat confusing to me, historically, so to speak,
Is it this one you're talking about?
yeah,
Okay.
is her hair.
Yeah.
Because it kind of looks like what we used to call an afro or a natural,
Yeah.
and certainly a very short one. And that was not the typical style at all among black women in 1963. Now already, well, I shouldn't say that too definitively, but that's my sense, and and also my recollection from that time period.
Right.
However, there is a marvelous photograph by Danny Lyon, who is a fantastic photographer and one of the great photographers of the Civil Rights Movement, a young woman being arrested in Birmingham in the spring events of 1963. And she definitely has an afro, and her face and her whole body language is very, how shall I put it, they all kind of fit together, because she's rebelling against the system, and she's rebelling against certainly the whole way of life in Birmingham and the South. And that's actually one of many famous pictures by Danny Lyon. But there's a woman in the spring of '63 with a natural, it just, I won't go on and on, but I'm very struck by Christopher kind of imposing that on her, so to speak, is very interesting to me in terms of what it suggests about him.
The hair was really interesting to me as well. I think you're onto something. I use the term, in my mind, natural also, and I've been going through these old fashion magazines to see, because I just have a limited memory, but to see what the styles were and such. And what I was more aware of, especially with women who were given some light in the civil rights movement, was more processed hair. And this, to me, it's less, when you look at the painting, it's less than a natural, it's like a cap, and it reminds me more of African sculpture. And I think in some ways, by not making a 1963 hairdo or a flip or something like that, he gives a sense of timelessness to it, so it's not just a statement about here and now. Do you want to comment on hair from your experience?
I'm the last person to talk about hair.
I was wondering, and when you showed the drawing next to there, that is it charcoal? What is it? Then the one on the left.
This one?
On the left.
Yeah. I mean, I think you did a really wonderful job of illuminating this painting and giving us lots of really amazing ways to think about it, and he's incredible. This, I wonder, have you thought about androgyny? I mean, and I'm thinking about, especially the work on the left, there are other ways of potentially reading that hair, and when you're thinking about it from the standpoint of androgyny or cross-dressing, or at least some kind of either unconscious or conscious effort to sort of conflate the male and female in this image, given the extent to which you've laid out his intense identification with the mask, and asked us to consider this as really less about the black woman and more about sort of disavowing white privilege, which is really fascinating way of thinking about this painting. And I was also just thinking about two other things. They're not really questions, sort of comments. The juxtaposition between the collage and the paintings, and your observation that he doesn't really deal with the black male body in painting, but the collage is almost all men, except for the sort of commodity references, which tells us something about the sources that he's working with, right, which are, kind of overwhelmingly concerned with rendering or, representing men, and women as sort of the buyers and consumers of commodity culture. But there is an interesting distinction there when he sort of goes to this overtly autobiographical painting. Suddenly we see men and male protagonists in this medium that plays with documentation. And that, so related to that observation is, when Kelly Jones was here last week, and she was showing paintings from the show, and one of the things that sort of emerged just in the sort of selection that she had chosen was this kind of recurrent emphasis on the female figure in a lot of the civil rights imagery. Whether it's Ruby Briggs as the sort of little girl being escorted into school, or whether it was the SNCC poster with the kind of...
and Ruby Briggs is 63.
Yeah, the poster's image that was used in a lot of the SNCC materials of the woman sort of studying, and she showed another painting, and I asked her at the time, it just found it sort of interesting that in this kind of propagandistic or imagery that was particularly focused on education, there was seemed to be a tendency to really characterize that through the female figure. And she was reading it as a kind of very empowering image of women. I mean, which it is. It can also be a way of neutering the threat of black rights, civil rights. This is something we see in Mexico, embodying the indigenous, indigeneity in the female form, because it's less scary than the sort of militant male figure. So anyhow, I was just sort of commenting and sort of thinking about, and she pointed out, of course, there are lots of images of very respectable black men in educational, civil rights educational images. And sort of thinking more about what is the virtue of rendering these questions in the guise of the female form as opposed to the male form. Long-winded.
I think, well, first off, the issue of androgyny is an important one. I think also he represents a certain kind of he represents the women with a certain body type that I don't often see white Americans represented, females. They're not these sylph-like, slender forms. They're kind of big, they're kind of sturdy, big women. So he's visually suggesting that these are women of strength. I don't know why he didn't turn to male forms. I think there is this discomfort, fear, threatening in working with it. And I just think traditionally using women's form because of the importance of women within all society, but the importance of women within Black society, as teachers, as mothers, as the people who are not being recognized. And he himself is overlooked in a manner because of his sexuality, and there's maybe a way he relates to the way the women are being pushed aside. He also he does this whole like archaeology of his life, trying to think about important Black people and all these name dropping and stuff, but he talks about the importance of his childhood nurse and the role she played, and it's a very conflicted image, and at times uncomfortable to read about. And yet he's pouring out this love, but yet it's for a paid servant. And there may be something about her place in his origins that he's paying tribute to.
And Mary, as Mary knows already, there is in fact that emerging literature on the visual culture of the civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement, which has found overtly androgynous images, particularly by Harlem Renaissance artists on the covers of magazines like The Crisis and Opportunity. And the rereading of those has actually been quite fascinating recently.
Maybe one more question? Thank you so
And
much.
Thank you.
Then I will also just thank Diana Linden. One of the things that when we first started talking about this, I was really moved by was the possibility of really uncovering the rich history of this quite powerful painting. And so I like being a cheerleader. We need more of that. Thank you so much.
I didn't fall.